I'm just curious, how many of you have been following the COP29 discussions and outcomes, and how close do you know what was meant to be decided and then what got decided at COP29? Okay. Yeah, okay. So just to give you a little bit of an idea, I'm not going to go into detail about it, but this was called the Finance COP. And the reason it was called the Finance COP was because there was a new quantified goal on finance that had to be decided, which was basically meant to be the sum, who's going to contribute, and what kinds of finance would be counted. So 3 key things that had to be decided for how climate action can be financed and how there can be solidarity between the developed world and the developing world, so helping the least capable countries to still adapt and mitigate climate change. And also loss and damage, which was decided last year as the first time to be included, how that would be financed as well. So that was meant to be decided at this COP. Big numbers were floated. There was huge divides between developed and developing world. And ultimately something was decided, but nobody is happy with what was decided. So I'm just sort of giving you this as a backdrop because I'll talk a lot about justice and equity considerations in climate mitigation policy specifically. I don't work so much on adaptation, though of course it's equally important in adaptation and loss and damage spheres as well. But basically I'm going to talk a little bit about why aspects of equity and climate justice are so important to the whole climate change issue and why it's important for climate policy. I'll provide one example of work we've been doing to try to apply fairness principles to determine how effort sharing across regions can be done to mitigate, to invest in climate mitigation to the extent that's required, that's consistent with the Paris Agreement, right? So we know that there's a 1.5 degree target that was agreed at the Paris COP, and basically we look at how one could apply fairness principles to determine how countries and regions can share the burden or the cost of these investments that are required. Then I will talk a little bit about a theoretical framework that we've developed with colleagues at IIASA to more explicitly consider equity and justice in climate research and policy. So there are lots of frameworks out there, different conceptions and definitions of different things, and we just try to streamline this a little bit to make it easier to speak the same language, to basically facilitate explicit considerations of equity and justice in climate research and policy. And then I'll try to, if I have time, give you a little bit of insight also into, so the way the Paris architecture now works is that every country, every nation, every party who signed to the Paris Agreement determines themselves how much they want to contribute to the climate effort, right? But there is still this agreement that it is a global problem and it requires a global solution. So when you add up all parties' efforts, it should lead us to the path of 1.5 degrees, yes? In theory. And then there is the question of every time the parties are asked to now update their nationally determined contributions, they have to now explicitly explain how they consider what they are stating is fair and ambitious. Because with each NDC, nationally determined contribution, they have to ramp up the ambition level, and they also have to say, from their perspective, what they're doing is fair. Yeah? So they have to explain that. So I will talk a little bit about a little sort of piece of work that we've done to try to help operationalize how countries can more transparently communicate what they mean by fair, yeah? Or how they're determining fair. So to begin with, just some pictures, because you may have seen pictures like this very often. I mean, basically, there has been a huge surge in terms of awareness compared to 10 years ago. It's still not great, but still there is a growing movement in terms of activism and demand for climate justice, yeah? And then also if we look at references to climate justice in global media, which is the left graph, and then also research that exploring climate justice on the right, you see that there's been a rise in terms of basically how this has become a more important topic, right? But also it's very much in the fine print there. You probably don't read it so well, but a lot of the research is really from Global North, and it's in English. So there is some questions of justice there, yeah? Then if you look at equities, the word equity appearing, or the concept of equity in the UNFCCC, this was already back in 1992, that this was included in the UNFCCC Charter, which is basically that everyone should address this problem, but it's on the basis of equity in accordance with this common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities principles, yeah? So there's kind of built into the UNFCCC the polluter pays and the capabilities kind of principles, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And in the Paris Agreement, the same statement, but then a clause at the end in the light of different national circumstances. Yeah? Because now the architecture for addressing climate change is this bottom-up architecture where nations decide, parties decide themselves how much they want to do, what they're going to do, how they're going to implement it. And so this, in the light of different national circumstances, became an important clause to include as well. So we know this, I'm not saying anything new to all of you, you know this. Basically, we need to slash emissions rapidly and now. And the big fairness issue here is how to do this fairly, yeah? So we've seen also with the latest IPCC report, I love this graph. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this graph, but it's basically showing you how we are basically leaving the next generations a much hotter world, even if we do everything possible today to stop what we've been doing, yeah? Because it's a cumulative problem, right? You've emitted the emissions, they're already there in the atmosphere. Even if you stop today, the effect of that cumulative problem is going to be affecting the next generations. And it just shows you different cohorts of people, those born in 1950, 1980, 2020, and how hot the shadings of the lines show you how hot they are going to, what kind of earth they're going to inherit, right? So there's a huge intergenerational issue of justice here, which we all know about. And if you look at the latest assessment of the emission gap report from the United Nations Environment Programme, it very clearly shows you that if you go along the current path, current policies, we're looking at temperature rise of 3 degrees or more, yeah? Even if you look at the most optimistic in terms of all conditional NDCs are implemented, all net zero pledges that countries have made will be delivered on, you're still looking at a 2-degree world. So it's not totally consistent with the Paris Agreement, which says we want to be well below 2 degrees and more close to 1.5 degrees, or consistent with 1.5 degrees as possible. Now, again, there are lots of contentious equity issues because there are differences in terms of what have been national or regional contributions to the problem. If you look at historical emissions, if you look at the current emissions of different countries and regions, and if you look at it on a per capita basis, it's very different, right? So if you look at historical emissions from 1850, you see that it's the rich OECD world that has contributed the most, but China is slowly creeping up there. If you look at contributions to warming, so not just the emissions, but then how much is that really translating into the temperature increase that we've seen already, then again, it's a slightly different picture, but it's quite similar to the historical emissions picture. If you look at current emissions, then of course China is the largest, but historically it's not. And then if you look at it on a per capita basis, it's again a very different picture, yeah? So people think about fairness in different ways. They consider different principles on the basis of which they determine what they think is fair. And it's a very contentious area because there are all these differences in terms of how equity can be perceived. And so if you look at the historical emissions, this is again just the similar thing, but like showing it now divided into the OECD and sort of developed and non-developed, developing or emerging countries. And again, you see 23 rich countries have contributed about half, and 150 countries in the rest of the world have contributed the other half, yeah? And of course, within these sets of countries, it's also a very different picture as to how much different countries have contributed. Now, in addition to these national differences or regional differences, there are also differences in terms of people within nations, yeah? So earlier on, you had the within country inequality, which was quite big, but that has shrunk a little bit. But inequality, between countries, it has shrunk. But within countries, inequality is rising, yeah? So basically, what this graph is showing you that is the bottom 50%, so the lowest 50% emitters have been responsible for about 16% of the emissions growth between 1990 and 2019. And the top 1%, just the top 1%, is responsible for almost a quarter of the growth that we've seen during this period, yeah? So huge differences. And again, if you look at it by wealth, you see this graph showing you exactly what we've seen on the previous graph, which is that the wealthiest contribute disproportionately to the emissions, yeah? Now, another problem or issue that we deal with when we're talking about the whole climate issue is that, in general, those who have contributed the most to the problem are affected less, and those that have contributed the least face the highest risk of impacts of climate change. That's just an unfortunate thing that we've seen, and this is a graph that kind of illustrates that, also from the IPCC last report. And the problem is that not only are there certain parts of the world that are at higher risk of the problem, but they are also less capable of addressing the problem because they are also experiencing multi-dimensional poverty and development challenges, right? So their vulnerability is very high. And this is, again, work that we've done at IIASA. We've developed a framework called Decent Living Standards, which is what we consider sort of the basic needs that everyone needs to have, the basic material requirements that everyone is entitled to live a decent life. So it's not just eradicating poverty, which everyone thinks, of course, has to be done, but this is enough to give them a decent life. And so it's things like housing, food and nutrition, clean water source, healthcare, social connectedness, so access to mobility and communication services, thermal comfort in the home, food preparation, clean cooking fuels, and a fridge to store food, or some cooling device to store food, sanitation, education, physical connectedness, and so on. Now, of course, people can disagree with this or agree with this, but it's one framework that we have defined of what decent life could look like for everyone. And then we've tried to map what parts of the world where are these services not still available to people. So the darker colors on this are basically regions where you have a higher proportion of the population that have at least 2/3 of these dimensions of decent living, and then the lighter colors are regions where very few % of the population have access. And basically you see sub-Saharan Africa, parts of South and Southeast Asia, still a large proportion of population lacks these basic services for a decent life, yeah? So, I now give you a little bit of an overview of some work we did recently. So following the last report of the IPCC, there was a lot of critique that the IPCC did not adequately address issues of equity and justice. And some of that critique is valid, some is politically motivated. So we thought we would try to address this problem systematically by looking at what were the investment requirements that the assessment determined is necessary to be aligned with 1.5 degree target, and how could we apply emerging fairness principles to determine what is a fair regional contributions for these investments, yeah? So basically we looked at these particular considerations or principles of fairness, and then we defined quantitative indicators and allocation rules to quantify basically fair shares, yeah? And again, people can differ on what are the right principles to use. We just wanted to be transparent in terms of which principles we used and then how we use them to, or interpreted them to operationalize them into quantifying these fair shares. And we considered responsibility, capability, and needs. We considered 2 indicators for each of them, which are listed there. And basically, what we came up with is this graph. Now, the graph looks complicated, but it's actually very simple. It's telling you for each region, what in yellow is an outflow. So which are the regions that should be making contributions for investments in other regions? Red is the inflow. So which are the regions that should be receiving funds from other regions to make the mitigation investments? And blue is what each region needs to do itself, yeah? So it's kind of giving you this fair regional contribution, telling you that basically, you know, whatever principle you apply, the principles are listed on the bottom x-axis. Normally, it appears, or we find that regions of the OECD, that's Europe, North America, Asia Pacific developed, they should be contributing, in addition to making their own mitigation investments, they should be contributing to mitigation investments in other parts of the world. And then basically Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, to some degree Latin America, should be receiving additional funding. And we quantified what the range of this interregional flow should be. So of course, depending on which principle you apply, the numbers are slightly different, but in the median, we saw that it should be around 600 billion, okay? Now the old quantified goal, which was supposed to be updated in this COP, was 100 billion. So we were estimating at least a 6-fold increase required just for mitigation, not for all, not for the total, but just for mitigation investments. And what was agreed on now at the COP was 300. And that's for the total, so adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, okay? So we can sort of, again, see how far we are. Okay, so I will introduce this framework very briefly because I know I'm running short of time. But the references are in there and we can discuss it in more detail also later, and we will have a workshop afterwards, so we could also use some time there to revisit it if needed. So basically, we were saying that, see, all aspects of climate research and policy have equity and justice embedded in it. But it's not always explicit how this is, what are the normative stances that people are taking, right? So we wanted to just create a common vocabulary so that people can understand and try to make more explicit their underlying assumptions, their underlying normative stances of what they mean when they're speaking of justice. So one is areas of justice, forms of justice, and I'll talk a little bit about this. Spatial scope of justice, are you talking about a local scale, a regional, national, global? Temporal scope, are you considering past emissions? Are you considering future emissions? Do you consider future generations? You know, these are all important questions that people should be thinking about when they're starting on some research or thinking about policy in this space. So when we talk about distributive justice as well, so distributive justice is the one that is the most considered or the most explicitly considered one. We need to distinguish between metrics and patterns. What do I mean by metrics? It's the thing that you're distributing, right? So what is it you're talking about when you think about distribution? What is the thing that you're talking about when you're talking about distribution? Is it welfare? Is it utility? Is it consumption? Is it resources? Is it well-being? I don't know what it is. You need to be explicit about that. And then what patterns of distributive justice are you considering? So there are many different patterns, and there are combinations of these also possible. So are you thinking about a utilitarian? That is, you maximize total welfare of a whole society or nation or whatever. Egalitarian, so it's all, everyone strives to minimize differences. You have equal shares. Or prioritarian, so that is basically you're trying to prioritize the worst off in society. Sufficientarian, are you prioritizing providing some minimum thresholds or floors to everyone? Or limitarian, are you trying to squeeze what is like overconsumption, so reduce the overconsumption at the top. So these are all forms of distributive justice, and it's important, I mean, they're all kind of patterns of distributive justice, and it's important to kind of be able to distinguish which one you're talking about and which one you are taking into account in your work. There are also questions of procedural justice, who is involved, how are processes designed, how inclusive are they, are you considering stakeholder participation, are you co-designing things or not, whether there is epistemic justice, in other words, of like, do you recognize other knowledges, indigenous knowledge or not? And it's basically sort of these kinds of questions that are important to consider here. Corrective justice, are you thinking about compensation or restoration for historical wrongs? Recognitional justice, do you respond to the cultural, historic, or specific identities of particular groups? And transitional justice. Now, transitional justice is one of those things that hasn't been written about much in the literature, but we thought it was an important element to also include, because when we're talking about future pathways, there are sometimes some losers at some points in time, but then they can be compensated so that over a period of time they are not losers. And so it's important to think of justice in a transitional sense as well. So when we talk about operationalizing normative equity stances, yeah, so I mentioned that all parties that are agreed to the Paris Agreement, have signed up to the Paris Agreement, they now need to disclose with their new nationally determined contributions how they consider that fair and how you consider that ambitious. And till now, they didn't have to do this, but now it has to be explicit. And so there's a lot of confusion as to how to do this, and we wanted to provide some clarity on one way of maybe operationalizing this, so that it's made transparent, and then basically countries can discuss in an open manner how differences are the views, how different are the views, and how this can move forward. So what we've sort of come up with as a process to do this is first make explicit the principles that you are considering that are the normative basis for defining what you consider is fair, right? So are you considering historical responsibility, polluter pays? Are you considering capability to pay? Are you considering some equality aspect or not? You need to make explicit what is this normative basis. Then, again, these are different normative principles that you might or might not consider, but it's important to make that explicit. Then, the allocation quantity, so the metric that I mentioned also before. So what is it that you're trying to consider a distribution of? So is it a finite carbon budget? Is it an obligation to contribute to carbon dioxide removal, or mitigation investment and finance, or renewable capacity scale up? I mean, you need to just define what it is that you're considering. And then finally, the allocation approach and indicators, yeah? So make very clear what is it, how are you operationalizing, how are you interpreting these principles to quantify, or in a qualitative sense, define your fair share, yeah? So, and if you are using quantitative, then what indicators are you using? What kind of rules are you using to do this? So, being mindful of the fact that we have another very great speaker to follow after this, I just want to now close this with some key takeaway messages. It's not meant to be any concluding arguments or anything of that kind, but just some considerations to think about as you're doing your own research and all that. One is, try to be as explicit as you can be about the normative stance you're taking in your research. Try to be explicit about the assumptions and try to reflect on that, because often we have it implicit in our work, but we don't really make it explicit, and it's important to do that. Understand interdependencies and repercussions of inequalities across human, ecological, and environmental systems, right? We talked a lot yesterday about human, non-human, and so on. And then try to define strategies that are sensitive to inequality across climate change, sustainable development, and well-being, because we are dealing with the climate problem, but it's not a problem that you can deal in isolation, right? You're dealing with the climate problem while you're trying to develop, while you're trying to improve people's well-being, while you're trying to reduce other kinds of environmental stressors, right? So it's something that you have to think about together. And then, of course, there are multiple facets and intersecting inequalities. So being aware of that is important as well. Going beyond economic inequality, of course, and moving beyond anthropocentrism, which we've talked a lot about also yesterday, which is like, okay, changing the human nature compact, thinking about how we can do that. That's all. Thank you.